Now let's talk about infrastructure. Are our roads, our power stations, our internet capacity ready to take us into the future? The National Infrastructure Commission says that the 3 C's, congestion, capacity and carbon, must be tackled or they could hold this country back. Joining us to discuss are Andrew Teacher, former head of media at the British Airports Association and Director of Strategy and Policy at London First, John Dickey. Welcome to both of you. John, if I can start with you, what's the current situation in terms of infrastructure in this country, good or bad?
Pretty grim. The truth of the matter is we've systemically underinvested for decades. We're still coasting on Victorian infrastructure. The Underground's over 150 years old in London, and we just haven't spent the money we need to spend to maintain and to modernise it. But critically, in many parts of the country, certainly in many of our cities, certainly in London, we've seen very substantial population growth. And so critically, we haven't invested in the capacity to enable us to move the growing number of people in and around our cities from their homes to their jobs.
OK, that's London, which a lot of people in the UK would think is, streets ahead in terms of people wanting to pump investment in and, generally things being good for infrastructure. What about the rest of the country?
Well, I mean, the rest of the country is lagging behind. You look at the north and you look at the conversations we're still having, and the debate is not, are we going to tunnel through the mountains and build new railways, but are we going to electrify the crumbling, rust-ridden railways that we've got? And I think many people look at London and they think, why the hell are you investing so much money down there? What about us? And the principal problem, in my time at BAA at Heathrow, that is one of the biggest privately funded infrastructure projects in Europe. But you look at the rest of the country, and Heathrow being a fantastic example of the problem that we have. And that problem is that everything is about politics. And infrastructure is a long-term play. It's a 10, 20, 30-year play. Politics is a 5-year play. The two don't marry up. And that is why that whether we're talking about roads, railways, airports or housing, we've seen very little happen. And I think the other thing that I think is missing from what Lord Adonis has come out of today, and let's be honest, he's said this stuff a few times over the years, but I'd asked a couple of questions. Firstly, when Tony Blair and Gordon Brown's Labour government was doshing out all the PFI cash, the Public Finance Initiative cash, to build hospitals and schools, why weren't they doing a bit more on infrastructure? That's a question that's not been answered. And I think, secondly, the other thing in what he's saying today, Lord Adonis, is that there should be also a focus on logistics, because, again, High Street is now an internet platform. Your High Street, everything you're buying now largely will come through the internet, a lot more. And also, I think, with all the Brexit negotiations, having this focus on trade, how we move goods around the country is something we need to think about. And again, if you look in the southeast, where DP World London Gateway has got this £1.5 billion port and logistics facility in Essex, and that's private money, 12,000 direct jobs. Those are the kinds of projects funded by private cash, not a penny of taxpayer money in there. Those are the sorts of projects that we need to be encouraging, and I think that's the big failing that successive governments have really left us.
Would you agree, John? And do you think, talking about politics and infrastructure, one being a long-term game, the other very much short-term, do we need some sort of body that maybe looks at these things in longer term that doesn't have any political tie? Well,
of course, that's exactly what the National Infrastructure Commission is. The National Infrastructure Commission is there to look at the long-term needs of the British economy, Britain's infrastructure needs, and to set out priorities and to give government a sense of what it needs to do to tackle the problems we face.
Are they doing their job?
So the NIC is doing its job, but the real challenge is not simply to set out what we need. It's for government to act, and it's got to act in two ways. It's got to act to provide the critical public investment that's needed, particularly in transport, but it's also got to act to unlock some of the private sector investment Andrew was talking about. So if you think back to 2010, we had a Labour government committed to expanding Heathrow. In the 2017 Conservative manifesto, there was a commitment to expand Heathrow. We still haven't expanded Heathrow. So we need decisive action to get the billions of private money that will give us increased capacity to trade with the world, increased jobs in the United Kingdom as a whole, increased connectivity between the cities of Britain and London and the world, and increased economic growth. We need that money to be invested, and we need to stop messing about. We need to get shovels in the ground, the third runway built.
I mean, I think the other point as well, the very simple fact here, is that anything you have that's got an income stream attached to it, whether it's a road, an airport, bunch of houses, some shops, that can be investable by institutions, by pension fund. Pension fund cash at the minute has been struggling over the last years. You've seen it with pension funds right across the piece falling to pieces because they can't generate returns, they can't generate yield income. But if you're investing in airports, railways, these provide solid long-term income for pension funds. And that's why, that's why companies like Legal & General are looking at housing, for example, because they see a long-term income stream in that. And I think the problem is that we need to think about infrastructure in and around. We need to think about the fact that when we're building a railway like Crossrail in London or HS2, that has to be thought about with logistics, with housing, all in mind, so that when you're creating a new railway station and suddenly all the land around it is worth treble what it was last week, that the government can capture some of that value, and that we can think about where we need homes, where we need schools, and the way that people are going to live around those structures. And there's one example of the stupidity in this. Crossrail in London isn't going to have any freight lifts in the stations. So we've got this railway that we're building through London, and we've got a city of millions of people buying stuff on Amazon, not on Alibaba yet, but on Amazon and eBay and whatever else, that we could be moving around on trains. Yeah. And so when Lord O'Donnell is talking about congestion, the left hand and the right hand need to be on the same arms, sure. Because at the minute it's just all a little bit ridiculous.
Okay, we'll have to leave it there. John, Andrew, thanks very much for coming to speak to us. Appreciate it. Let's bring you some breaking news. John McDonnell, the Shadow Chancellor.